He didn't disappear. He just stopped answering. Not because he was tired, not because he was offended, and definitely not because he didn't care. He just fell silent. And there was no emptiness in this silence. There was a silence that didn't require explanation. Like a night that doesn't ask why you're not sleeping. Like tea that has cooled down but still smells of mint. He was sitting in the kitchen, where the clock had long since ceased to be a guide. The light from the lamp was warm but not bright. The phone was lying face down, a symbol that the outside world wasn't the main thing right now. He didn't disappear. He was just listening to himself. And that was brave. Because listening to yourself means facing what isn't always comfortable. With fear, with doubt, with those parts of yourself that don't want to be public. He hadn't planned this pause. It came of its own accord, like rain that begins without warning. First a drop, then another, and now the whole sky is silent with you. He didn't look for silence, it found him. And it didn't demand anything except presence. There was no drama in the silence. There were no loud decisions. There was something else. Slow, honest, like breathing after tears. He didn't write to anyone, didn't answer questions, didn't explain why he was silent. Because for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to be understood. He wanted to be himself. Without translation, without adaptation, without roles. This is not an escape. This is a return. To himself, to what had long been drowned out by the noise of expectations. He didn't disappear. He simply stopped being available to everyone in order to become available to himself. And this is not weakness. This is courage that doesn't need applause. In this silence, he began to hear things that had previously passed by. What his own heart sounds like when you don't have to be strong. How the memory of childhood smells, when there was no fear of being uncomfortable. How something hurts that for a long time had no right to hurt. He didn't become different. He didn't turn into a sage. He didn't find all the answers. But something in him became clearer. Like water that had stood still for a long time and now reflects the sky. He didn't disappear. He just listened to himself. And that's brave. He didn't expect the silence to bring fear. It seemed that silence was peace, like a warm blanket after a long day. But as soon as the external noise died down, another appeared. An internal one. And it wasn't gentle. It was a fear that didn't scream, but breathed next to him. Like a shadow that didn't ask for permission. At first he tried to ignore it. He turned on the music, flipped through the tape, looked for something that would drown out this feeling. But the fear didn't go away. It wasn't an enemy. It was a part. The part of him that hadn't had the right to speak for a long time. And now, when everything around her was quiet, she finally spoke. It wasn't the fear of death or loss. It was the fear of being himself. The fear that if he told the truth, he wouldn't be understood. That if he remained silent, he would be forgotten. That if he wasn't useful, funny, productive, he would become unnecessary. And this fear wasn't a fiction. It was experience. It was the memory of times when honesty had been punished by the silence of others. But this time he didn't run away. He stayed. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and just listened. He listened to fear say, "You're not enough." And he answered, "I am." He listened to fear whisper, "You won't be noticed." And he answered, "I see myself." It wasn't a fight. It was a conversation. Like with a friend who had been silent for a long time because he didn't know if he would be accepted. He allowed himself to be afraid. Not to hide, not to run away, not to convince yourself that everything is fine. But simply to be with this fear. As with a part of yourself that deserves attention. And in this is courage. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to stay by your side even when it is scary. He did not become a hero. He did not overcome himself. But something changed. He was no longer afraid of being afraid. And this is freedom. The freedom to be imperfect, not ready, not confident. The freedom to be alive. In silence, fear does not disappear. But it ceases to be a monster. It becomes a voice that wants to be heard. And when you listen, it stops screaming, simply speaks, and you simply are. He didn't wake up with a decision. He didn't say to himself, "That's it, enough of being silent." It was just that one day, between a sip of tea and a look out the window, something changed. Not suddenly, like snow that melts not from heat, but from time. He didn't become different, but he began to notice himself. It wasn't a return to the world. It was a return to himself. To someone who doesn't always have to be strong, cheerful, productive. To someone who has the right to be silent, to cry, to be afraid. And not to explain it to anyone. 'Cause he's not a function. He's a person. He began to speak. Not loudly, not confidently, but honestly. The words didn't fly like arrows. They were born like sprouts. I didn't disappear. I just listened to myself. And it wasn't an excuse, but the truth. The truth that doesn't need to be defended. Because it's not an attack, but a presence. He was no longer afraid of being uncomfortable. He was not afraid of pauses in conversation, tears in his voice, trembling in his hands. Because each of these things is proof that he is alive. And that his life is not a performance but a process. A process in which silence is not a failure, but part of the music. He was not in a hurry. He did not set goals for himself to become himself by the end of the month. He simply was. And in this is strength. Strength that does not need proof. Strength that is born from permission to be weak. He began to notice little things. How the air smells after the rain. How Yulia's voice sounds when she says something ordinary, but with tenderness. How his own heart reacts to silence, not with fear, but with gratitude. Because silence was no longer emptiness. We came home. This was not a return to normality. Because he no longer wanted to be normal. He wanted to be real. And authenticity is not always convenient, but always alive. He did not disappear. He simply listened to himself. And now he speaks. Not for everyone, but for those who hear. And for myself first and foremost. He didn't come back loudly. He didn't write a post. He didn't announce that everything is fine now. He simply responded to the message again one day. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And this desire wasn't a compromise. It was a choice. A choice to be present without losing himself. He didn't become different. He didn't turn into a version of himself that always knows what to say. But something inside him became deeper. Like water that had stood still for a long time and now reflects the sky. He was no longer afraid of silence. Because he understood. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is the space in which truth is born. He began to speak to others, but no longer out of a need to be heard, but out of a desire to be honest. His words became slower but more precise. He was no longer afraid of pauses, because he knew. There is life in pauses too. And even in silence there is love. He began to write letters to himself. Not for publication, not for likes, but for himself. As a reminder that he is. That he has the right to be. That he doesn't have to be strong, cheerful, productive all the time. That he is allowed to be afraid. And that fear is not the end, but the beginning. He no longer looked for an answer. Because he understood. Sometimes a question is also a home. Home where you can just be. Without explanations. Without haste. Without the need to prove anything. And when someone says, "You disappeared," he will be able to answer, "No, I just listened to myself." And that is brave. Because courage is not about loud actions. It is the ability to stay close to yourself even when you are scared. It is the ability not to run away when everything inside asks for escape. He did not become a hero. But he became himself. And that is more than any victory. Because to be yourself means to be alive. And to be alive means to allow yourself everything. Silence, fear, tenderness, laughter, and tears. He did not disappear. He simply listens to himself. And that is bold.